Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed for another hotly anticipated review. This time I'm looking at the Alienware AW3926QW, Dell's take on a 39-inch 5K 2K ultrawide OLED gaming monitor. This is Dell's first 39-inch OLED, and it's really tempting, hitting that sweet spot ultrawide size that I've talked about in the past. It's bigger than standard 34-inch models, leading to increased immersion while gaming and more desktop screen real estate. This isn't the first 39-inch 5K 2K ultrawide to hit the market. That award went to the LG 39GX950B that I reviewed in April. At first glance, you might think this Alienware model is just a variant of the LG, but they actually don't use the same panel, and this leads to substantial hardware and performance differences. The Alienware model uses an RGB stripe subpixel layout with a glossy screen coating, while the LG model uses RGWB with a white subpixel and a matte screen coating. You might not think that subpixel change would have much influence, but it fundamentally alters how the OLED panel functions in terms of brightness and colors. I'm going to be comparing the two models a lot throughout this review and highlighting their differences, but there are also quite a few similarities. Same 5120 by 2160 resolution at 165Hz, with the 2560 by 1080 dual mode at 330Hz. Same 1500R screen curvature, and both use the latest generation of LG Display tandem WOLED technology. Before you ask, yes, even though the Alienware model does not have a white subpixel, it's still WOLED, as the W in WOLED refers to the white emissive layer, not the white subpixel. This white emissive layer is used for all the subpixels filtered into each color. Dell have simply opted for a version that is RGB stripe. The other substantial difference between the Dell and LG models is the price. I thought the 39GX950B was too expensive in my review, as it launched at $1,800 US, a seriously high price for a gaming monitor in 2026. The AW3926QW is set to cost just $1,100 US when it goes on sale later this summer in North America, which is significantly cheaper than LG's model. Is this an excellent deal for what appears to be similar hardware, or are there performance differences that explain this price discrepancy? Let's dive into it. First up, let's look at the subpixel layout, which is the most substantial change compared to the LG model. Dell are not lying here. This is indeed an RGB stripe version of this 5K 2K panel. There's only 3 subpixels, red, green, and blue, in a traditional layout. This is the closest layout to an LCD that I've seen in terms of arrangement and size of each subpixel. And it's not just a case of Dell disabling the white subpixel, it's not physically present on this panel, with the RGB subpixels increasing in size relative to those same colors on the RGWB panel. The removal of the white subpixel has a significant effect on how this WOLED panel works. On previous panels, whenever the display had to show white, it would primarily activate the white subpixel and either dim or switch off the other RGB subpixels. With the RGB stripe layout, to show white, all 3 of the subpixels must fully activate. This has both benefits and drawbacks to the overall presentation. The RGB stripe layout is better for text rendering. Modern font rendering uses subpixel level techniques to improve text quality, but this relies on the renderer knowing the exact subpixel layout of the display. These font rendering systems were designed around the RGB stripe layout used in most LCDs at the time, so they produce the best quality when the display uses an RGB stripe. That's exactly what this Alienware monitor provides, so you get identical text quality to an LCD. The RGWB panel version gets somewhat close to RGB stripe because it has the R, G, and B in the correct order and in a stripe layout. But often when rendering grayscale text, like black text on a white background, the display would primarily use the white subpixel instead of the RGB subpixels. And if it did use the RGB subpixels, there's a physical gap between the G and B where the white subpixel is. This causes a clash between subpixel font rendering and the display's physical operation, which can lead to subpixel level text artifacts. The 39-inch 5K 2K RGWB panel is not particularly problematic in terms of text artifacts, and I think it's great at text rendering, primarily because it has a high 143 ppi pixel density. But the Alienware model with an RGB stripe is sharper. I used both side by side, and for fine line details in fonts of various sizes, the RGB stripe panel looks better, with more consistent anti-aliasing and sharper edges. There's a double whammy effect here because the Alienware's glossy finish also improves text clarity, as this finish has no coding grain, which on the matte LG model introduces a slight haze that softens text. How noticeable will the text quality difference be in practice? That will depend on your sensitivity to artifacts and how good your eyesight is at resolving fine detail. If I was going to choose one of these panels for desktop app use with lots of font rendering, I'd pick the AW3926QW with the glossy RGB stripe without question, as I do think it's a noticeable improvement. Removing the white subpixel does have some drawbacks though. On the RGWB panel, only one subpixel needs to be active to show white, whereas on the RGB stripe panel, all 3 subpixels need to activate to show white. This gives the RGWB panel an advantage showing white. It can either deliver higher brightness at the same power level, or it can run more efficiently than an RGB stripe panel at the same white brightness. We'll see the effects of this later in the review. I mentioned it briefly already, but the screen coating is another major difference between the Alienware and LG models. Dell are using LG Display's standard 0% haze glossy finish, whereas LG Electronics are using the matte option. The Dell glossy finish is identical to what we've seen previously on other glossy W OLEDs, such as ASUS's True Black Glossy and Gigabyte's Real Black Glossy coatings. The best choice of coating depends on your usage environment and personal preferences. Matte tends to be the optimal choice in brighter environments or rooms where you have less control over how much direct light hits the display. Glossy tends to be better in dimmer environments or rooms where you can control lighting to give you the optimal experience. To expand a bit on this, the main advantage to the glossy finish is that it doesn't diffuse light that hits the front of the panel. At certain angles, this means that instead of incoming environmental light spreading out and hurting clarity, you get an isolated reflection and minimal impact elsewhere. This can help to preserve black levels and perceived depth. It comes at a cost though. As the panel cannot diffuse light, the screen has a mirror finish that's prone to direct reflections. The layer structure does, I guess, a decent job of minimizing these reflections, so they're not terribly distracting, but anything bright is quite visibly reflected, especially when viewing darker content. The curved nature of the screen also affects reflections. This can be a good thing because the curve reduces the reflection field of view, so to speak, so items to the side of the monitor are less likely to be seen in reflections versus a flat panel. But when something does get reflected, its reflection will be distorted and stretched horizontally, which could exacerbate the reflection and make it appear larger and more distracting. If you can handle reflections, or if you can position the screen in a way to minimize reflections, I think the glossy screen coating looks better. As I mentioned earlier, the screen has no coating grain, so the display is sharper versus matte coatings with grain. The type of glossy you get with these tandem W OLEDs in particular is excellent, and you really do get deep blacks even in moderately lit rooms. Matte coatings do have advantages in some situations though. The way they diffuse light eliminates the mirror finish and significantly reduces the visibility of reflections. Yes, it does this by spreading out light that hits the surface, but it's a great way to remove annoying distractions. Mirror finishes can be especially problematic when you have light sources directly opposite the monitor, like if you have to use the display near a window during the day. Matte coatings deal with direct lighting much better, so if you have a particularly bright room, or if you find reflections extremely distracting, matte is the way to go. One of the best aspects to the AW3926QW, like the LG model, is its size. A lot of the ultrawides that we've seen so far have used a standard 34-inch 21:9 format, which is equivalent to a 27-inch 16:9 monitor in height, but with 20 centimeters of additional width. It's a large panel with great width, but it doesn't have a lot of height, especially in an era where 32-inch 4K displays are becoming more popular. 39 inches in a 21:9 aspect ratio is a much better size for immersive gaming. We're now getting the same height as a 32-inch 16:9 monitor with 22 centimeters of additional width. It's the height that is a massive upgrade here, as it allows the screen to occupy much more of your vertical field of view. It's actually pretty wild how much difference 5 centimeters of height makes, comparing 39-inch to 34-inch formats. But when you consider the 39-inch panel is 32% larger in area overall, it makes sense why it's a lot more immersive and impressive at a standard viewing distance. It's also not so large that it's difficult to fit on a desk. The even bigger 45-inch format, which is another 33% larger, is pretty ridiculous with a width of over 1 meter. This 39-inch monitor is 92 centimeters wide, and while it's large, it feels manageable. It's smaller in width than most dual monitor setups, for example, making it a potentially suitable single-screen alternative. HDR Performance is perhaps the most interesting aspect to the AW3926QW. While this display uses tandem WOLED technology like the 39GX950B, the switch from RGWB to RGB stripe actually leads to quite significant performance differences in HDR content. Brightness output is different, and Dell have configured this display in a unique way. The best way to describe the AW3926QW's HDR performance is that it performs like a QD-OLED, or at the very least it's the most QD-OLED-like experience I've seen from a WOLED panel. This goes right down to the HDR modes that Dell offer, which are labelled identically to the modes offered on the recent AW3426DW. I'm not sure whether panel limitations have forced Dell to create a QD-OLED-like experience, or whether they always wanted the modes to perform in that way to align with the rest of their Alienware lineup, which use QD-OLED panels. There's multiple different modes, but the main ones of interest are the Display HDR True Black mode, the HDR Peak 1300 mode, and the HDR Peak 1300 Bright mode. The other available modes are all similar to the True Black mode. Dell used display-side tone mapping over DisplayPort that cannot be disabled, so metadata influences the level of roll-off at higher brightness levels. 10,000 nit metadata has much more gentle roll-off than 1,000 nit metadata, which prevents highlight details from being crushed, although in games where you can set the peak brightness level and therefore the metadata, you'll mostly see performance like the 1,000 nit data when the brightness level is set correctly. The True Black mode is a classic True Black experience. Brightness is limited to around 500 nits, but this mode is otherwise reasonably accurate. Bright content and dark content performance is strong, though in very bright scenes there can be some panel dimming present. Color saturation is good in this configuration. The Peak 1300 mode is very similar to what you get on QD-OLED panels in their peak modes, which is to say brightness is now uncapped, with the panel able to achieve up to around 1200 nits in dark scenes. In these darker scenes, EOTF tracking is accurate and color performance is very good. But when we get to bright scenes, there is panel dimming, exactly the same as we see on QD-OLEDs. This is unusual for a WOLED, which on previous panels didn't often come with modes that would operate like this. Normally WOLEDs avoid panel dimming entirely. The Peak 1300 Bright mode corrects panel dimming in brighter scenes to some extent, similar to boosted brightness configurations on QD-OLED screens. However, this comes at the cost of over-brightening dark content, which is a clear trade-off. The Peak 1300 mode can halve brightness in bright scenes. The Peak 1300 Bright mode can double brightness in dark scenes. This is a very different set of configurations to what is found on the 39GX950B. The LG monitor over-brightens in all modes, so perhaps that model is trying to hide panel dimming by always forcing an over-brightened configuration. It's hard to say. This means on the Dell model, the Peak 1300 Bright mode offers the most similar experience to the LG model, and you can effectively choose to run it in an LG-like way if you want to. However, Dell also give you the choice to remove over-brightening in the Peak 1300 mode at the expense of panel dimming, so Dell have at least one option which is significantly more accurate in darker scenes than the LG model. And then we have two different lower brightness modes. The Dell option is capped to around 500 nits, but the LG model's similar mode with peak brightness set to low is better, as its brightness cap is around 800 nits. However, on the LG, even that mode is over-brightened, meaning the Dell model's True Black mode is more accurate. I'm sure this is all very confusing, so let's take a look at some comparison charts, and then I'll give the lowdown on which overall HDR mode set I like best. In dark scenes, the Alienware offers the best choices. The True Black mode and Peak 1300 mode are decent without being amazing, while the Peak 1300 Bright mode is pretty inaccurate. In comparison, the LG model is not that accurate in either of its main configurations. In bright scenes, the LG model is superior in both of its brightness configurations. The Dell model's best configuration for bright scenes is not as accurate, and the Peak 1300 mode is quite inaccurate, all things considered, due to panel dimming. The LG model is also generally a little better in color performance, though these results include the luminance error. I personally prefer the way Dell configured this display because you have a choice. I was a little frustrated that the LG model has over-brightening in all modes, so Dell giving you more options is better. LG do have an advantage in the lower brightness mode, but I don't typically use that mode, so overall I'd give the win to the Dell. However, I'm not enthused about panel dimming on this WOLED and was really disappointed to discover this regression compared to previous panels. This means there's no single optimal HDR configuration. The best choice varies depending on whether you're mostly viewing dark or bright content. If you go back and look at a 1440p tandem W OLED, in this case the Asus XG27AQWMG, you'll find a better max brightness configuration. Here we get some overbrightening, but not across the entire image like on the Dell 5K 2K model in the peak 1300 bright mode or the LG model. It's only really highlight brightness that gets boosted, not shadows, so the image looks more accurate than the Dell model's peak 1300 bright mode. But then on the Asus Tandem W OLED within the same mode, we get effectively no panel dimming in bright content. Obviously, I'd like perfect EOTF tracking all of the time, even in dark scenes, but how the Asus model is configured is kind of the minimum I would have liked to see from this new RGB Stripe 5K 2K panel. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be, and we end up with performance much closer to a QD OLED, which isn't necessarily a bad thing as QD OLEDs do perform well, it's just not quite at that elevated level that we usually see from W OLEDs. Synthetic brightness performance is also interesting. The AW3926QW has average full screen brightness output of 282 nits, which is 20% lower than the 39GX950B, but similar to QD OLEDs. 10% window brightness reaches 512 nits, again very similar to the latest generation of QD OLEDs, but well behind the LG model, which is 58% brighter. But then for 2% window brightness, the Alienware model achieves up to 1235 nits, which isn't that far off the LG model, falling 11% short. This is within the same sort of range as 2026 QD OLED panels used in the latest ultrawides. Brightness versus window size is therefore quite illuminating. The 39GX950B has clearly the best brightness output for whites, especially between a 5 and 25% window size, but really all the way down to the highest window sizes. The AW3926QW performs sort of like the newest 34-inch V-Stripe QD OLED in terms of peak brightness, but quickly falls back to delivering brightness more in line with older QD OLEDs at higher window sizes, like 25%. The RGB Stripe W OLED then slightly picks up at a 100% window size, but generally speaking, both the LG model and 2026 QD OLEDs outperform this RGB Stripe W OLED in brightness. We see more evidence of this in our real scene brightness tests. The AW3926QW in its peak 1300 mode is most similar to the peak 1000 mode on the AW3425DW QD OLED from last year. In fact, it doesn't quite reach that level of brightness in high APL scenes, though it can outperform it for the highest peaks. The newer AW3426DW is 18% brighter on average across these tests, with a similar level of panel dimming, so that's a bit disappointing. The LG model is simply much brighter, achieving a 48% higher average result across our 8 test scenes, though this is with significant overbrightening. Unfortunately, while the peak 1300 bright mode does brighten the entire image, it doesn't magically make the panel deliver overall brightness like the LG model, and in fact, it can cause brightness regressions in some scenes as it pushes the panel into a higher APL state to show the same content. So what we see in the synthetic 10% window test is somewhat representative of real-world content. The LG model's RGWB panel can really push brightness to a higher level, and removing the white subpixel hurts white brightness. There is a silver lining though, and that's color gamut and brightness. Now the Alienware model actually doesn't quite hit the same Rec 2020 color space coverage as the LG model. Both are 99% DCI-P3, but the 39GX950B achieves 83% Rec 2020 versus 77% on the AW3926QW. That's still a good result for the Dell model though, which is in line with modern QD OLEDs and superior to W OLED models prior to the tandem generation. But where the Dell model has a massive advantage is in color brightness. In the best cases, the RGB Stripe panel is over twice as bright, displaying individual colors compared to the RGWB panel. If we think about this in terms of a white level equivalent, the LG model delivers color brightness in line with what you'd expect from a panel that can only achieve about 500 nits of white brightness, whereas the Dell model delivers color brightness in line with a 1200 nit panel. Effectively, to achieve such high white brightness figures, the LG model is only boosting white brightness through its white subpixel, whereas the Dell model is more even in its brightness output between white and colors. This leads to a color volume advantage for the AW3926QW. Even though the color gamut is not as large and white brightness is not quite as high, overall color volume is 14% higher. This puts the RGB stripe model roughly in line with QD-OLEDs, though not quite on that level. Color brightness figures are very close to QD-OLED, closing the gap massively between the two panel technologies in that area. The AW3926QW supports Dolby Vision, similar to the latest 34-inch QD-OLED. This is not a feature that LG offer with the 39GX950B, so it's unique to the Alienware, and it does add some value. The way Dolby Vision works in Windows these days is a bit different to the early days of this feature. Previously, if you had Dolby Vision enabled, it would always be used, even if you were displaying regular HDR10 content. This would mean HDR10 content would always get mapped to Dolby Vision, and often this would hurt performance. However, that's not how it works as of mid-2026. Now, with Dolby Vision enabled, Windows will automatically switch to the HDR10 mode when it detects HDR10 content being played. The screen briefly flicks to black as it switches out of Dolby Vision mode and into HDR10 mode. This is a much better way of operating because it ensures the correct monitor mode is being used. If you find the mode switching annoying, you can disable Dolby Vision in the OSD, which will then always use HDR10. For PC users, Dolby Vision is not especially useful as most content does not support or use Dolby Vision. There are some Dolby Vision enabled games, but very few, and none of them are recent. Clearly the ecosystem there needs work. However, you might find that some streaming services will use Dolby Vision for video playback. Dolby Vision support is much more relevant if you plan on hooking up a media player to this monitor, as dedicated media players often have much better Dolby Vision support than you'd see on PC. The downside to the Dolby Vision mode is that it only offers the brightness capabilities of the display HDR True Black mode, so brightness is limited to just over 500 nits. In some cases, you might prefer disabling Dolby Vision anyway, forcing content into the HDR10 Peak 1300 mode to achieve higher brightness. However, the true black nature of the Dolby Vision mode actually provides an advantage on PC with the new mode switching capabilities of Windows. The Dolby Vision mode is brighter and looks better for tone-mapped desktop apps than the HDR10 Peak 1300 mode. With Dolby Vision enabled, you get this nice auto switching where the desktop benefits from true black type performance while the HDR10 content then gets the full Peak 1300 experience. I should note here that not all content automatically mode switches. For example, watching an HDR YouTube video in Chrome will stay in the Dolby Vision mode even though the content is actually HDR10. This is also the case with some games. It's a bit hit or miss as to what games are actually detected as HDR10, but definitely a large chunk of games I tried will auto switch. Moving now into motion performance, Dell is stuck with the same limits as LG when it comes to this panel's refresh rate. LG Display opted to utilize just a 165Hz maximum refresh rate in the 4K 2K mode, and that's pretty low for a modern flagship monitor, especially considering 32-inch 4K equivalents hit 240Hz and the latest 34-inch QD OLEDs hit 360Hz. The refresh rate essentially dictates the motion clarity you get with an OLED monitor. This is because all OLEDs have extremely fast response times in the 0.3 millisecond range, so there's no difference in motion clarity when comparing two OLEDs at the same refresh rate. The only way you can get better motion clarity out of an OLED is to run it at a higher refresh rate, so the models with the highest refresh rate produce the best clarity. The AW3926QW topping out at 165Hz puts it at a disadvantage compared to higher refresh rate OLEDs. The fact OLEDs work like this has some pros and cons when we're talking about lower refresh rate models. The main con is pretty straightforward. If the game you're playing could be run at a frame rate above 165 FPS, motion clarity would be better if the monitor had a higher refresh rate. For example, a game that could be played at 200 FPS will look better on a 240Hz OLED than a 165Hz OLED. The main pro is that if you're gaming at a lower frame rate, there's no benefit to having a higher refresh rate. For example, if you're playing a game at 100 FPS, it doesn't matter whether this monitor is 165Hz or 240Hz because the display would operate at 100Hz regardless. This is especially relevant given we're talking about a 5120 by 2160 resolution, which is difficult to run. It's 33% more pixels than regular 4K, so achieving above 165 FPS will be a challenge. If you primarily target 80 to 120 FPS in single-player titles, for example, the 165Hz refresh rate poses no limitation. However, these days there are a lot more options available in games that increase the frame rate. Running major titles at native 5K 2K will be difficult, but upscaling is very viable at this resolution, even using lower performance modes. Depending on the game, this could send frame rates above 165 FPS. Then there's frame generation, which works best on super high refresh rate displays. With the 165Hz refresh rate, the maximum native render rate you can achieve is 82 FPS using the minimum 2x frame gen mode without exceeding the monitor's refresh and introducing tearing. This means on a 165Hz monitor with FrameGen enabled, the latency experience caps out at around 80 FPS. This is really where a 240Hz refresh rate could have made a difference, as it would have allowed a render rate of up to 120 FPS with FrameGen. Like with the LG model, when you have all of these modern gaming options and a variety of games on the market, I really think this display should be 240Hz. It doesn't sting as much on the Dell model as it's much cheaper than the LG model, but it's still a high-end display that should be offering a high-end refresh rate. Now, this monitor does have dual mode support, which when enabled runs the screen at 2560 by 1080 at a refresh rate of 330Hz. This is a potentially useful option for fast-paced multiplayer games, but it's not a true substitute for a high native refresh rate, as it drops the resolution to something 1080p class. On a large 39-inch monitor, 2560 by 1080 doesn't look the best. The screen is definitely blurrier, so this mode is designed purely for gaming, where better motion clarity is more important than a high resolution. The AW3926QW does not use integer scaling for its 1080p dual mode. One 1080p pixel is typically made up of between 4 and 6 native pixels, depending on the situation. This is the standard scaling method used across most dual mode screens. Because the subpixel layout of a native 1080p panel is different to a 5K 2K panel, there is no scaling method that will make the dual mode look like a true 1080p panel. Not even integer scaling will achieve this. While the resolution isn't amazing, dual mode does work very well. Switching between 5K 2K and 2560 by 1080 is seamless. It only changes the resolution and refresh rate. Every other aspect of the monitor's performance is identical. Dell offer 25-inch and 27-inch screen size emulation in the dual mode via the esports mode in the OSD, but these drop the resolution further. The 25-inch mode runs at 1520 by 885 at 330Hz, for example. On an OLED like this, 330Hz is also genuinely clearer than 165Hz, so there's definitely a benefit to using this mode. It's not something I personally found useful, but if I was more of a fast-paced competitive gamer where latency and clarity matter, it's something I'd consider using. It also makes the monitor more versatile with the ability to run a broader range of games. It isn't purely designed for single player. Input latency is low across all the modes, including SDR and HDR, both in the 5K 2K mode and the 2560 by 1080 dual mode. I also found that the 60Hz mode had a low processing delay, so console gamers playing below the maximum refresh rate should still enjoy relatively low lag. The only real consideration with input lag on this monitor is the refresh rate itself. Higher refresh rates lead to lower latency and a more responsive experience. And as I said, 165Hz isn't a premium refresh rate these days, so relative to 240Hz monitors, it's not as responsive, which you can see from this chart. Dell have implemented an anti-flicker mode accessible through the OSD, which is disabled by default. This mode does not work the same as the OLED anti-flicker modes I've seen from brands like Asus, which increase the minimum refresh rate in the VRR mode. On the AW3926QW, whether the anti-flicker mode is on or off, the minimum refresh rate remains at 48Hz. The good news is that the anti-flicker mode is effective at reducing or eliminating VRR flicker. OLEDs are prone to flicker during large frame rate fluctuations, which I don't typically notice in gaming sessions, but do sometimes see during loading screens or menus. In situations where I saw flicker, enabling anti-flicker did reduce this flicker. The bad news is that the anti-flicker mode appears to affect how variable refresh rates are delivered to the display. This mode doesn't disable VRR or change the range, but in my testing I noticed it reduced the smoothness of gameplay, especially when there were some minor frame rate fluctuations, which would otherwise be smooth. Leaving this setting disabled leads to a smoother experience, so that's my recommendation and would probably explain why it's disabled by default. This monitor has good SDR accuracy out of the box. The color temperature is great, leading to natural tones. The gamma is decent, around 2.2, and grayscale delta E's are also in the good range. There are the usual concerns with oversaturation for SDR content, as no Rec 709 gamut emulation is used by default. With this panel having a wide color gamut, colors in the SDR mode are expanded to fill that gamut, making skin tones redder than they should be, as one example. However, there are several configurations that can be used to improve SDR performance. One is Windows Auto Color Management, which eliminates oversaturation and leads to much better color accuracy with a color checker delta E average of 5.5. The other is using the built-in sRGB mode, which is less flexible than using ACM, as it locks most settings and leaves you unable to adjust white balance. With that said, Dell have done an above average job of calibrating the sRGB mode. White balance is still very good in this configuration, with improvements to gamma, reducing the grayscale delta E ITP average. Saturation and color checker results are better than I saw using ACM, and with the color checker average results below 5.0, this indicates great factory calibration. When comparing these results to other monitors, the AW3926QW falls in the middle of the grayscale chart. Not as well calibrated as the AW3426DW that I recently looked at, but a bit better than the LG model. In color checker, this monitor is also in a good position, again not quite as good as the 34-inch model, and in this test similar to the LG model. Dell don't offer hardware calibration here, but the sRGB mode is a great choice for people that want the best SDR accuracy. Full screen SDR brightness is interesting given the subpixel differences between the Dell and LG models. The Dell model does a good job of producing a usable level of white brightness at 293 nits, but it can't match the LG model, which is 9% brighter. The Dell model is still brighter than most QD OLEDs with True Black 400 tier brightness, fitting more into the True Black 500 tier, which makes sense given its rating, but it is on the lower end of that scale. Dell advertised 300 nits of brightness. My unit fell short by 2%, which is pretty close, nothing unusual. Like most OLEDs these days, the SDR mode uses uniform brightness, so you won't see annoying brightness shifts depending on window sizes. Minimum brightness is good at 37 nits, and viewing angles are excellent, though of course this is a curved monitor, so you realistically want to view it dead on. Uniformity is a contentious issue with tandem W OLEDs due to a flaw known as grey banding. However, I'm happy to report that grey banding is not an issue on this monitor. The ugly vertical bands seen in dark grey content on the 1440p tandem W OLEDs are not seen on this RGB stripe 5K 2K panel in either the 165 or 330Hz configurations. This is a notably better result than I saw from the RGWB panel on the 39GX950B. Now, the LG model doesn't have bad banding issues, and it's typically difficult to spot the problem, especially relative to 1440p units. But the Dell model is clearly better. It's able to produce more consistent grays with fewer artifacts. The AW3926QW doesn't quite reach the level of perfect grey uniformity. There is still a small, very faint amount of dirty screen effect viewing the darkest greys. But this W OLED gets the closest to a QD OLED that I've seen in terms of grey uniformity results. In fact, it's significantly better than other W OLEDs, perhaps a neat benefit of the move to an RGB stripe. White uniformity is pretty good as well, no problems there. Power consumption is another interesting difference to other types of OLED panel. This monitor uses a lot of power to display full white, 85% more than the 39GX950B with its white subpixel. That's the difference between having to activate all three RGB subpixels versus just a single subpixel on the LG model. Relative to 34-inch QD OLED panels, power consumption is about 50% higher displaying white from a 32% larger panel in area. Relative to the latest 32-inch 4K QD OLEDs, power consumption is 32% higher from a 25% larger panel. So scaling is more favorable to QD OLEDs, meaning the W OLED RGB stripe panel is less efficient than QD OLEDs that also use 3 subpixels to display white. However, the difference in power consumption between the RGB stripe and RGWB panels shrinks significantly in typical game content because now on both panels, a mixture of pixels need to be activated. In this test, the Dell model still uses 20% more power, but that's not a crazy figure in my opinion, and the results here are fine, despite power consumption obviously being on the high side. I also saw 33% higher power consumption than the PG32 UCD-M3 with its current Gen 32-inch QD OLED panel, which is in line with the white results. For port selection, we have one DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20 port, two HDMI 2.1 48GB per second ports, a USB-C with DP alt mode and 90 watts of power delivery, and a multi-port USB 5GB per second hub. The USB-C and USB-B on the rear are upstream ports, then there's two USB-As and a USB-C for downstream. One of the USB-As and the USB-C are conveniently located on the bottom edge of the display, making access super easy. All ports are capable of 5120x2160 at 10-bit 165Hz, and of course there's support for console-like resolution such as 4K. DSC is required for HDMI, but is not required when DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20 is used. Dell provided DSC toggle to disable DSC in the OSD if you want to do so. There's also KVM switch functionality here. Dell have packed in several features to the OSD, which is controlled through a directional toggle on the rear of the display. There's several preset modes and color controls, a dark stabilizer, picture-in-picture, DSC toggle, and RGB LED lighting controls. Most of Dell's gaming features are found within the Alien Vision mode, which allows you to add crosshairs onto the screen and apply some color filters to a defined area on the screen. Unfortunately, Dell's OLED care settings are non-existent. OLED panels are susceptible to permanent burn-ins, so they're not a great choice for continual static content, like using desktop apps for long periods. Dell have implemented OLED care features that will slightly shift the screen and dim it in certain scenarios, all the usual typical stuff. You just can't control those features at all. They're always enabled. In better news, Dell still offer their 3-year burn-in warranty. The AW3926QW uses a variation of Dell's latest Alienware monitor design, enlarged to accommodate the 39-inch panel. It looks broadly similar to the 34-inch models from 2025 and 2026, including a similar use of a deep blue plastic finish across the outer surfaces. It's probably a little blacker than we've seen previously, but it's not quite neutral black and has a dark overall appearance. But if you do look closely, it's tinted blue. The overall build quality is very good and befitting of an expensive high-end product. There's a couple of design differences compared to the 34-inch QD-OLED though. The rear panel still looks sleek and excellent in my opinion, but there's now a more extensive ventilation cutout to help cool the monitor panel. There's also active cooling internally, though the fan speed is low and essentially silent even under bright and warm conditions. As we're moving from a QD-OLED to WOLED panel, there's no chin on the front, with a more even four-sided design with typical bezels. There's a rounded stand pillar with a cable management hole, and the base is a small square that doesn't use up too much desk space and allows you to put items on top of it. It's quite compact considering the size of the display. The stand has acceptable strength to resist wobble and supports height, tilt, and swivel adjustment. The maximum level of height on offer is pretty good, though it doesn't get as tall as the LG model. Ultimately, the Dell Alienware AW3926QW is one of the most interesting monitors I've reviewed in a long time. It's the first panel I've tested to use WOLED technology without the white subpixel, which leads to substantial performance differences. In some areas, this monitor is stronger and better than previous tandem WOLEDs. In other areas, it doesn't perform as well. This makes it very difficult to crown an overall winner in the 39-inch category. The big battle here is between the AW3926QW and the LG 39GX950B. Both use a 39-inch 5K2K tandem WOLED panel at 165Hz, which on face value is the same spec, so you might expect a similar experience. But I'd say there's actually more differences between these monitors than similarities, which seems crazy to say when both use the latest tandem WOLED technology. I'll briefly summarize these similarities first. Both have the same panel size and resolution. This is a fantastic ultra-wide format for immersive gaming. It's noticeably bigger than 34-inch ultra-wides, it offers more screen real estate for desktop apps, and it envelops more of your field of view. The pixel density is in line with 32-inch 4K displays, which is highly suitable for this panel size, as is the 1500R curvature. The refresh rate and motion experience is also the same, 5120x2160 at 165Hz or 2560x1080 at 330Hz in the dual mode. At 5K2K, it's certainly a fine and usable refresh rate considering it's a high resolution, but it's on the low side for a flagship gaming monitor in 2026. 34-inch ultra-wides are up to 360Hz these days, and 32-inch 4K options have been 240Hz for several years. Like with the LG model, this really should be a 240Hz display, but both are 165Hz. SDR performance is great, especially in the sRGB mode. With per pixel control and zero-level blacks, we get fantastic contrast in both the SDR and HDR modes. Response times are lightning fast. These are all the usual benefits we've come to love from OLEDs. At the hardware level though, the Dell model uses a fundamentally different panel with an RGB striped subpixel layout compared to an RGWB subpixel layout on the LG model. The exclusion of the white subpixel changes performance quite significantly, even though the underlying emissive WOLED structure is the same. What we end up getting is a WOLED panel that's actually quite close to a QD-OLED in overall performance, for better and sometimes for worse. The RGB stripe layout improves text quality, and when combined with the glossy screen coating Dell have opted for, overall sharpness and clarity is noticeably better. I don't hate the matte coating on the LG model, and the RGWB subpixel layout is hardly a disaster at a relatively high pixel density, but side by side, I prefer the way the Alienware panel looks. I just really like the WOLED glossy finish, and it's great to see it as an option on a 39-inch ultrawide for the first time. The new layout seems to have brought big improvements to dark grey uniformity as well, almost eliminating banding and the dirty screen effect relative to the RGWB 5K 2K panel. It's a night and day difference versus the 1440p tandem WOLED panels. The new panel is more power hungry though, and appears less efficient than QD-OLEDs that also use 3 subpixels. The most substantial performance difference comes in brightness. SDR brightness is relatively similar, both options can achieve around 300 nits, but the LG model pulls ahead in the vast majority of situations involving bright whites in HDR content. Peak brightness is slightly higher on the LG, but it's in mid-range scenes where the LG is able to pump out much higher numbers, leading to an almost 50% higher brightness average in our real scene testing. That white subpixel really is effective at giving a white brightness boost. But other areas of HDR performance are better on the Alienware model. Color brightness is twice as high in the RGB stripe panel, leading to higher overall color volume and a more QD-OLED-like experience. I also prefer the way Dell have configured the HDR modes. LG forces you to use an overbright configuration, whereas Dell give you the choice not to. This means the Dell model is generally more accurate in mid to lower APL content, though this comes at the unfortunate cost of panel dimming, the first time I've seen QD-OLED-like panel dimming on a WOLED screen. Though I wouldn't fully absolve the LG model of panel dimming. It looks like they are using an overbright configuration to hide the problem, which is not a real fix and is something we've seen from panel dimmed QD-OLEDs previously. The strengths and weaknesses here make it really difficult to definitively call one panel better than the other. You can see why LG Display offer both options. The RGB stripe variant that Dell use has better text rendering, better uniformity, and better color volume. The RGWB variant that LG use is generally brighter and more efficient. You may prefer one set of over the other. To me, I prefer the way the AW3926QW looks. I prefer the glossy screen coating, better dark grey uniformity, sharper visuals, and the greater control Dell offer over the HDR modes. Sometimes I don't want the overbright look of the LG option, even if that means panel dimming. There's a few other bonus features that Dell offer which are largely unrelated to the panel change. You get Dolby Vision support, a KVM switch, a somewhat useful anti-flicker mode, and a proper 3-year burn-in warranty. LG's exclusive features like the AI upscaling mode and hardware calibration support are not as strong of an offering in my opinion. Plus, the LG model, thanks to Windows, might install annoying bloatware on your system, which I'm sure you've seen recent coverage about. The real killer though, the big elephant in the room, is the massive price discrepancy between the models. Dell confirmed to me that AW3926QW will be available for $1,099 US when it launches at the end of summer in North America, which is a whopping $700 cheaper than the MSRP of the LG 39GX950B. I honestly can't believe Dell is selling their model for a near 40% discount relative to the LG. I suspect it will fly off shelves at that price point. Going into this review, I thought that maybe the price difference would be explained by some sort of feature or performance difference. Maybe the RGB stripe layout leads to too many compromises. But I actually think the Dell model is better, so saving $700 relative to the LG is a complete no-brainer and gets a full recommendation from me. I'm sure the LG will get significant discounts in the back half of the year, which is what LG always do with their monitors, but wow, at the MSRP, the 39GX950B is now massively overpriced. And just in general, I feel like $1,100 is a much more suitable price point for this display. Dell offer a 34-inch 280Hz QD-OLED ultrawide for $800 US, the AW3426DW, so having the larger 39-inch display available at a $300 premium makes sense. In some ways, it's amusing how similar they perform, given it's QD-OLED versus WOLED, but as I've mentioned, this is the most QD-OLED-like WOLED yet. I actually recommend the AW3426DW as well, so once again, Dell are the best option for a high-end ultrawide gaming monitor, now at 2 sizes. And that does it for this mammoth review. Hopefully you've all found it useful if you're interested in one of these 39-inch monitors. If you do want to support Monitors Unboxed, there's a couple of ways to do that. Check out our monitor.deals website. We'll be adding this monitor to our website once it is available in the US. You'll be able to track prices on there. You'll be able to see when it's available at a discount or at a good deal. And we've also got obviously lots of other products on there to check out. So monitor.deals is a great way to support us. You can also use the links down below to purchase this monitor if you found this review useful, check pricing, all that sort of thing. You can do that via monitor.deals or via the other links. It's just totally up to you. We've also got Patreon. If you want to sign up and support us directly, doing so is great because you get access to things like our Discord community to ask questions about monitors. We've also got our calibrated settings and all that sort of thing. So thanks for watching. We've made it to the end, and I'll catch you in the next one.